Thank you all so much for joining today. I'll be presenting today. I'm Faye Kuzman. I'm the extension agent for horticulture here in Woodford County. And I'm going to be talking on gardening and raised beds. And it's good timing to be talking about that because as we've had so much rain here lately, gardening and raised beds is a great way to be able to go ahead and get started and not worry so much about the ground being wet since the soil drains out fast. So we'll talk about all those things in the presentation. So I was going to start off by just showing what we started off with. I've been gardening all my life, grew up on a farm. My parents raised vegetables as part of their living. And so we sold to farmers markets and did in commercial vegetable production. So I've had a garden all my life and tried a lot of different things. So we moved into our house that we have now about 5 years ago, and we started with mounded beds and sort of like traditional garden, in just directly in the bed. But with these, I like to mound it up just because I get the good drainage and I have very set beds to plant in. And so we started off like this, and then we went to what we have now, which is raised beds. So this is our main garden, and my husband likes growing giant pumpkins. So we do have a designated area for some of the bigger things like watermelons and corn and pumpkins that we do like to grow. But for our main garden that we do with our spring and summer and fall vegetables, we have these raised beds. So I'm definitely a fan of them. And so I'll talk about everything that goes along with that, but there's other types of raised beds, of course, too. So we'll talk about those. So I know that Adam last week in his beginning vegetable gardening presentation talked a lot about all the things like planting your garden and stuff. So I won't go into a lot of detail there, but just mapping your garden and keeping notes from year to year helps a lot, especially when you're growing in raised beds. And if you have a lot like I do, I always forget where I've put things. And with vegetables, to be able to keep disease down, it's good to be able to rotate those crops. So keeping a map of where you had what from past years really helps. And then if you're figuring out and you're first timer and you're trying to figure out how much you need of each crop and things like that, I know you've probably heard this in many presentations now, but our ID 128 Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky Guidebook, we actually just got a new updated version of that does have some good updates in it. So most of those can be found. You can pick up a hard copy at your local county extension office. We just got ours in, and then you can also find that online. So I'm sure one of the agents here will put in the link to that to find that updated version, but it includes all of the information on how much of a crop you'll need, because it'll say how many plants to plant for a family of 4 and examples like that. And so keeping records of what you liked, what you didn't like, what did well, what didn't. And then thinking about locating your plants wisely. So putting perennials in an area, not mixing them in with the garden so that you can easily go in and till or whatever you need to do. And then thinking about especially with raised beds where you have less space, you want to think about putting taller plants on the north side. And then as we talked about before, crop rotation is important as well. So I'm going to move over some of my screens real quick. Sorry about that. And then I'll switch to the next slide. If I can, there we go. Okay, so as far as planting dates, once again, this can be found in that Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky Guidebook. And it's important in thinking about your planning of your garden because there's spring and fall crops that are the same type of crops for spring and fall, and then your warm season crops, which grow in the summer after our first frost. Those can be put out starting the beginning of May, kind of around Derby Day, usually is our last frost date. So all of that kind of information. And then of course, if you wanted to start your own seedlings, now would be the time to start your peppers and tomatoes and things like that. And that schedule of when to plant those and transplant them can be found in that guidebook. So this is just an example of in that Vegetable Garden Kentucky, showing you what dates to start planting things in the garden. So that's just talking more about the planting aspect of this. And then of course, now we'll go into more of the nitty gritty of gardening and raised beds. This is another, just one other slide about different vegetable varieties, and something to think about with varieties if you're growing in a raised bed is you might consider they have a lot of new varieties that are smaller, more geared to container planting or in raised beds where you have less space. So a lot of gardening seed catalogs will have that information in there and tell you if they're smaller varieties. All American Selections is another opportunity to look at really great varieties that have been tested all over North America. You can find their website there, www.all-americaselections.org. And they have varieties that are selected for home gardeners for more compact and mature faster for if you're doing containers or also in raised beds. Okay, so now we're going to go into talking about raised beds and why, some of the advantages. So I'll go into each of these aspects of the advantages of it. So as far as better drainage, as I mentioned in the beginning, we've had a lot of rain. So one good thing about a raised bed is that the soils are going to drain faster. So even after a lot of rain, the nice thing is you can go in a raised bed and still plant and not have to wait as long as a traditional garden in the ground. And then generally they are amended. The raised beds are amended with things like compost, peat moss, and other organic materials that automatically will help improve your soil structure and thus aid in better drainage. So then, of course, if you have better drainage, you will have better root development, and the plants just can perform a little bit better. And then that goes into sometimes you can get higher yields from the plants. Because if they have that enhanced root growth where they have a lot of soil and space to grow, a lot of times they can be healthier plants. And then most times you don't have a lot of space devoted to walkways. And so that, you can plant more densely and get more production. And then one other thing, and then the reason why we decided to go to raised beds was less weed growth. It's just easier to maintain. So then you have less competition from weeds. So we have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And then of course we both are working full time, my husband and I, so we don't have a lot of time to designate to being in the garden. So one of the big reasons that we went to raised beds is because we could maintain them easier, keep the weeds down. And so that's why we like them. Another reason might be that you could expand your growing season easier. So you can start earlier in the spring because you're not waiting for the soils to dry out, because you have that improved drainage, and also the soil will warm up faster. And then you can easily put over little hoops to put row covers over for the winter. And I'll show you that. And you can maximize the space by succession planting, which I'll cover a little bit. But as you can see here, you can easily put a hoop over the garden and extend that season into the winter. And then, as I mentioned already, ease of maintenance, which is one of the biggest reasons that we do our raised beds. Less stooping for people that don't want to have to bend over as much, but that's of course if you go higher. Ours are pretty, they're only 6 to 8 inches tall, so you're still going to do a lot of stooping, but definitely less weed growth, and so it's much easier to pull the weeds because you have really good loose soil. The other reason we really like it is it's very easy to put in soaker hoses or drip irrigation, and so we don't have to worry about watering. And I'll show you pictures of our irrigation. And then another big reason people do it is if you have difficult sites. So actually in that area where you saw there, it looked really nice on the ground, but it was an old gravel road that went to that barn in that picture. So some of the areas there, it was our best spot for a garden because it got full sun 6 to 8 hours a day. And it was conveniently located to our house where we would actually go out and not have to, go too far to the garden. And of course we had a water source close by. So it was ultimately the best spot for the garden. But with that road there was a little compaction. The soil wasn't the greatest, so that was another reason that we put the beds there. So definitely difficult sites, raised beds are great for, because you can amend the soil. So as far as design considerations and what you want to think, you definitely want to eat with any vegetable gardening, you want to get that 6 to 8 hours of sun a day. And then as far as the bed width, you want to have a maximum of 4 feet wide. 3 foot is more practical because you don't want to be having to reach way across. So, you know, you want to keep them at a minimum of 4 foot wide. 3 foot is the best. And then of course the height of the bed, obviously taller beds are more convenient, but they're going to require a lot more materials, not only in whatever the material you're using to build it, whether it's wood or cinder blocks, but also more soil, and the soil can become expensive. So thinking of those things, we'll talk about the depth and everything as we go too. So now I'm going to go into the types of raised beds. So there's many different types. So you can do mounded soil, like I showed. So the mounded beds that I started off with is a type of raised bed. And they're easy and inexpensive to build, because basically you're just going through in what you're going to create as the rows in between the beds and shoveling the soil and just scooping it on top until you've created all those rows, and you have those mounded beds. And so the trouble with that, and the reason we didn't keep up with it, is because all through the season, those beds are going to settle and the soil is going to move out. And so you're having to scoop that soil back up. So it can be a lot of back work. And then also the weed pressure was pretty bad with those too. So just having the time, you know, to go in there and get the weeds, it's manageable, but definitely that throwing the soil up can be a lot of work. But you can go in there with tillers if you need to. And usually they're about 6 to 8 inches in depth. Now, the other nice thing about raised beds that I don't think I talked about, but for soil health, you know, there's a lot of proponents now of no-till, just because you build a lot of microorganisms in the soil and you're not just disturbing them with tilling, or it doesn't, you know, tilling can sometimes hurt the structure of the soil. And so with raised beds, normally you're not needing to till because that soil is nice and loose. And so that's another good thing, is that you don't normally have to till with raised beds. And so these are just other images of mounded beds, and then the ones that I showed you that I made at our place. Okay, and so the wooden frame beds, now these are the most common and most popular, easy to work with. Now I know a lot of people are concerned about treated lumber, and so you can always line those with something plastic or whatever if you need to, but there's a lot of rot resistant materials you can use. So you can use cedar, locust, even oak. Some of those are a good option for keeping them from rotting. Now with ours, we just used unfinished lumber. So obviously it's not going to last as long as your pressure treated, but the lumber is cheaper than pressure treated. And we've had ours for 6 years now, and some of them are beginning to break down a little bit, but they still have some life in them. So you can expect, you know, 6 years out of untreated lumber. And then you might have to start replacing some boards. And so these are pictures of wooden raised beds. And I have a little video demonstrating, hopefully we'll have time to get to that. I want to keep this under an hour, but that shows you how to build just a simple 4x4 raised bed. So then there's an option of using masonry and stone. You can do blocks, any kind of thing. Concrete blocks are probably the most inexpensive and easy. And you can also fill the blocks where the holes are and grow things like herbs and stuff in there. So that's kind of a cool way to incorporate those in there. And here's some different ideas. You can see in the one picture, people planted herbs in there. And so then you can create your bed using those as well. And I see, do you recommend any products to treat cedar that's safe for beds growing food? And honestly, with the cedar, if you're going to use cedar, I just wouldn't recommend treating it at all, because most of those products that you're going to treat them with, I'm not sure, you know, with polyurethane or anything like that, is probably not going to be as safe. But you could always do the outside of them. I know here we, just to make them look a little bit nicer, we did put some stain around the outsides of the beds, and it helped a little bit. But of course, your main rotting is coming from inside where the soil is. So then there's lots of other materials, recycled materials. You can use old tires, but some people worry about contamination with that. But there's a lot of old utility poles that those big poles is something that, or railroad ties that people will use, straw bales, which they're going to rot down, but then you can use it as a mulch. Pallets, they can be used. They do rot down pretty fast, but because they're thinner than even using what I use is the pressure treated 2x6s or 2x8s, the pallets are even thinner than that, so they do break down faster. But as you can see here, people get very creative. Giant containers, you can use those livestock watering tanks because they already have a removable drain plug, so you can easily remove that and even make some more holes so that you have good drainage. But people use, you can see there are all kinds of different ideas, old bathtubs, you name it. People have come up with unique ideas for creating their raised bed. And there is a thing of straw bale gardening, which is a whole nother topic, but you can get creative with all kinds of types of different materials to make your raised bed. Lasagna garden is another thing that could be a whole topic in itself as well. But basically it's layering organic materials over time, your compost, your leaves, your straw, and you start building it in the fall so that stuff has time to break down to be then planted in the spring. So you start with, you know, your newspapers and your cardboard, and then just keep layering things on that. And it helps to cover it with a tarp over the winter to help that stuff break down faster if you have that heat. And then square foot gardening, there's a whole book on square foot gardening. And this is really great for really maximizing your space. If you're only going to have maybe 1 or 2 beds, this can really help with maximizing. And it gives you a whole, all the information on dividing the plots into 1x1 squares and how many of the different things that you can plant. And it's so for example, you plant 1 tomato plant in a square, but you could put 4 lettuce plants and 9 bean plants in each square. So it walks you through all of that, and it's a great way to maximize space. So as far as constructing your raised beds, typically you want them to be at least 6 to 8 inches tall. 6 inches is pretty much the minimum you want to go because you want to have enough growth for enough soil for the roots to grow in. And then of course, if you're wanting it for mobility purposes, for not as much bending, then you're definitely going to want it to be taller than that. But keep in mind, you know, it's going to require a lot more soil materials. And then as I mentioned before, you don't want it any more than 4 foot wide. And really, you know, 3 foot is really good. And then between the beds, just 1.5 to 2 feet, depending on what you're wanting to do. If you're going to mow in between, or if you, we just put down, we called a tree company and asked them if they were in the area to dump some wood chips off at our house, which of course we got home one day and there was this giant mound of wood chips in our driveway, but that was okay because we used it in between the rows, and we have so many raised beds that it was great for using in between the rows and for mulching in different areas. So the length, of course, is variable. I prefer shorter just to be able to easily walk around them. I have some here at the office that are 16 foot long, which is pretty long, but you know, they can be all different lengths. And this actually, in the picture here, is what we built for here at the extension office. And we actually just used fence planks. I got from a local feed company here in town. And so we just stacked 2 planks on top of each other, and they were oak planks that we use for horse fencing. And so they last a long time because they're oak. So we just stained the outside of them a little bit, as you can see here, to make that darker color. But that made them a little bit taller as well. And so we kind of dug down the soil underneath. So as far as your prepping of the site where you're going to build your raised bed on, you can take a weed eater and just scalp the ground all the way down. And then people will put like newspapers or cardboard and then put the soil on top of that. So we dug down just because it was a little overkill, but we also had an unlevel spot. So we needed to kind of level it up a little bit. And so that's one of the main reasons we dug down, but otherwise you can just scalp it down with a mower or a weed eater, and then put that newspaper or cardboard, and then start putting your soil in, build your bed, and then put your soil in right over top of that. As far as material cost, so there is a great publication, and I have the link in the resources at the end of the presentation, but it gives you kind of, I think, a cost analysis of using different materials. Now here I'm just looking at building them with either just lumber or concrete blocks. And this is for a 4 foot by 4 foot by 6 inches high raised bed. And this is talking about lumber only, or material only, and not including soil. If you built them with pressure treated lumber, a 4 by 4 bed would cost $26 in lumber. Untreated pine lumber, which is what we used on our beds, $22. And then cedar boards, which are going to be more like 1 inch thick, but that would be $40. As you can see, as you get more expensive if you buy, but this is the price for getting from like box stores lumber. So I would always recommend, if there's a local sawmill, so I know there's one in Lawrenceburg, in Anderson County, that some folks have used to get rough sawn cedar lumber, and it's so much cheaper, and then it lasts a really long time. That's a great way to get that a little bit cheaper. And then if you did with concrete blocks, it would be $25. And of course, those prices are going to vary. That just kind of gives you an example of how much that would cost. But then, of course, with the soil, it's all going to depend on what you use. So if you have some of your soil that you can use, your native soil that you can get from somewhere somewhere in your garden, existing garden, or somewhere else, then that works great. You would just mix it with some compost. But if you're starting from scratch, really a good mix would be, if you're going to buy bagged, because you're only building 1 or 2 beds, then a good mix would be topsoil, compost, and peat moss. And it would kind of be like a third of all of those mixed together. Otherwise, if you're going to build a lot of beds, and what we do, because we do have a lot of beds, is we order from some bulk soil places. So there's a place that has like a 50-50 mix of topsoil and compost. And so we order that in bulk, and they come and deliver it. And then we can fill a lot of beds. And that's definitely more cost effective than purchasing bagged soil. But if you were just doing a couple beds, then obviously it's not going to be cost effective, because it'll be expensive in bulk and you'll have to pay delivery. One other thing I'll say about buying bagged soil, there's a lot of soil products out there that are raised beds, garden soil, that are sold in a bag. So just do some price comparison, because that's going to be sold at a much higher price than if you buy the things separately. So for example, you're buying a bag of raised bed soil, it's going to have these things of compost and peat moss in it, and it's going to be more cost effective to buy the topsoil and bags separate, and the compost and the peat moss, and just mix them together. So let's see, I'm going to show you this video just briefly, because I think it will kind of help get a good picture of, and I think we're good on time. So I'm going to stop sharing and then reshare my screen for you to watch this video, if I can find it. Let me see here. Well, let me see here. Sorry about that. I am not finding it on my screen. Let me pull it up again. Let's see if I can get it to start. And I apologize for the delay here. Okay. This should work. And if one of the agents on here, once I get it up, if you could let me know if you have sound and the video, that would be great.
Hi, my name is
Faye. We're good, Faye.
I'm a horticulture agent at the Woodford County Extension Office. And first I'm going to talk about the materials that we have here.
First, I have 2 bags of compost that are 1 cubic foot each. I have 3 bags of topsoil that are also 1 cubic foot, so it's a total of 3 cubic foot of topsoil, 2 cubic feet of compost, and I have a bale of peat moss, which is 3 cubic foot. Now you need a total of 8 cubic feet to put in a 4 foot by 4 foot by 6 inch deep bed. There are a lot of online calculators you can use to figure out how much soil you need to fill a specific size of bed. But for our purposes, we're doing the 4 foot by 4 foot bed. In the lumber, I bought untreated 8 foot long pieces of wood by 6 inch deep. Now 6 inches is the minimum that you're going to want to have in depth. Preferably you want to have at least 8 inches, but anywhere from 6 to 8 inches, and some people prefer more like 12 inches so they don't have to bend over as much. So we have cut these 8 foot pieces into 4 foot each, and then you want to have a drill and some screws. So next we are going to prep the site that we're going to put the bed on. So here I just put up some flags that I measured off 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot. You have a couple options on prepping the soil. So here I scalped it with a weed eater, and as you can see, scalped it down to bare ground. You can also do this with a push mower at the lowest setting, or you can take a shovel and just scalp that top layer off. So basically I just pull the top layer of grass off and then toss that out to the side. So then you're at least down to bare soil, and then we will build the raised bed next. So now I have my 4 foot by 4 foot bed placed on the ground that we have scalped. And next I'm going to pre-drill a hole in one end so that I can get the screws in. So I got my bit here, I'm gonna pre-drill the hole. And then now I'm going to put the screw in. For the purposes of this video, I'm using 2 different screwdrivers, but obviously you'd be just using one with 2 different drill bits. Okay, so you're going to repeat that on all 4 corners. And then one option you have, I don't normally do this, but it does add extra, I guess, strength to the bed, is you can add this little 4x4 post to each corner, and it just strengthens up the bed a little bit, but that's something you don't have to do. So now I'm going to add the soil to the bed. As you can see here, I've put down some newspaper, which is always a good idea to make a barrier between the grass on the bottom that could potentially come up and then the soil. So if you can put some kind of layer of newspaper or cardboard or something that's going to break down, that's always a good idea. So now I'm going to put in my compost. I'm going to throw everything in and then just mix it up at the end. I'll fast forward through this a little bit. I'm just dumping soil out here, but as you can see, we're just mixing it all together. So now that we have all of the soil mixed up, and then the rest is just talking about things I've already started discussing with you all about building raised beds. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now, if I can. Let's see here. Okay, let me skip down to where we were. Are you seeing the PowerPoint okay, everyone, except for me having to put it in presentation mode?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so we are back to, here we go. Actually, it looks like I'm on the wrong, there we go. Okay. Okay, so as far as plant spacing in the raised bed gardens, there's some general garden plant spacing information in your Vegetable Gardening Kentucky Guidebook. Of course, your seeds, seed packets, or whatever you're planting is going to have that information on it as well. But the nice thing is that for spacing in the raised bed garden, a lot of time the spacing is talking about in a traditional garden where you might need more space between rows because you're putting, you know, one plant, whereas you have a bed that you're putting 2 or 3 rows in, In a traditional garden, you're putting one row and then another row, and you need more spacing in between that. So you can put them in a little bit closer in raised beds. But just always think about with disease pressure, you know, you still want to have good spacing for airflow to go through, and not have moisture hold if things are too close together, which can cause disease. Let's see, that did not, oh, okay. Okay, so for maintenance of the raised beds, the big thing, a good benefit in the spring is that they do heat up faster. But of course in the summer, that also means that they're going to dry out faster and the soil is going to be a little bit warmer, and just not hold moisture as well. So a big thing about raised bed gardens is you do need to have a plan for watering. So we have a really good drip irrigation system that we've put in that was relatively simple. It's just a drip system that we have on a timer, and timers are pretty cheap to buy. We just put the timer on the hose and then set it for a certain time early in the morning of in the day. And then that goes on for, you know, however long. We can easily turn it off when we've had a good rain. So, and then also using mulches like straw so that you can help keep the soil moist and cool and conserve that moisture in there. And then another thing you want to think about is they do settle. So every year, pretty much every spring, we have to purchase in more compost or that compost topsoil mix that we get in bulk to top those beds off. And sometimes it's every other year. So like this year, we haven't had to worry about it. It usually about every other year. We do have to plan to top that off. So think about that as well, because you are going to have to be buying soil over time to keep them topped off. So this just talks about in that Vegetable Gardening Kentucky Guidebook. I know I keep referring to that, but it is like a great reference for all of this stuff. But this tells you critical times to water. So just thinking about watering, this is a good reference. As far as feeding your raised beds, or organic soils that have organic matter, compost and things in them, they do hold on to nutrients longer because compost just feeds over time rather than like a quick feed like Miracle-Gro or something like that. They do provide nutrients over time, but you do still need to feed your plants. So you still want to take a soil sample like you do with any other garden just to see what your raised bed soil is like and get your soil sample through your local county extension office. And normally we recommend doing every 3 to 5 years on those soil samples. But with raised beds, you might want to do them more often if you're adding in a lot of different amendments. If you're just topping them off, it shouldn't be a big issue. But you know, everybody has different fertilizer, different ways they would like to fertilize. So side dressing, I usually just side dress through the season. And this is a really great chart in that Vegetable Gardening Kentucky Guidebook that tells you good times to side dress. So normally you won't really have to initially apply any fertilizer before you plant if you have good organic matter like compost in there, but you do want to think about side dressing through the season. There's lots of different fertilizer options out there depending on what your soil sample says your soils need. I know here in Woodford County, our phosphorus levels are always super high, and potassium usually is too. So we most often only need nitrogen. So finding us a fertilizer that contains high nitrogen and not hopefully zero of the other nutrients if you don't need them, or at least low amounts of those nutrients. And then of course, thinking about, and I think Adam discussed some of this too, but integrated pest management, thinking about planting varieties that are more disease resistant. Some things about raised beds is that it might be harder to rotate if you only have a couple. So if you're planting things like tomatoes year after year, you might start to get disease pressure from early blight and other diseases. So if it's harder to rotate, you want to think about getting resistant varieties. And then regular scouting of your plants, just keeping an eye out before something like pests get really out of control. And that will help prevent having to spray when you don't need to. A lot of times you can just go squish those bugs by hand and not have to spray anything. So some different things, vertical gardening with raised beds. So I always grow like our cucumbers. I build a little on one side, the north side of the bed. I will put a trellis up then I just use chicken wire, or there's all kinds of different trellising techniques, but I will grow the cucumbers up one side, so then I can plant whatever in the bed and the front side of it. So you can really do some intensive gardening where you put a lot of things in one space. So then, enjoying your raised bed. So it's fun. You can, it can be a little costly to construct initially, but it is easy to maintain, and you will be surprised how much you can grow. We grow always way more than we can use. And we have all this raised beds, and we've actually started incorporating some perennials like strawberries and asparagus in them, because we end up not needing all the space in the beds. So here are those references that I talked about, the Vegetable Garden Kentucky, and then the Gardening in Small Spaces. And I think the other agents on here did put links to those. And then I did want to call your attention to our next series of classes in this webinar series. If you haven't already seen them, we have them plans for April, May, and June. Lots of really great topics. So it'll be similar to this. There is a different registration link for this. And so those will be coming up starting April 1st. And now I will take any questions, and I'll stop sharing because it'll be easier to see.
All right, Faye, thank you so much for all that good information. We did have a couple questions. I'm scrolling down to them now. Someone had just a little recap. Someone had asked at the beginning about the Webinar Wednesday program. So if you missed that, the link to those is in the chat box. And then we had also the publication that Faye mentioned several times, the Home Gardening in Kentucky publication, that is in the chat box, as well as a link to vegetable variety recommendations. So one question, let's see, you answered that one. Okay, so one question we have, we recently purchased a house with an established raised bed. Last year was our first grow season in this garden. We experienced a few different fungal issues, flower rot, early blight, etc. Can I eliminate fungal growth in the soil, or at least slow the progression in the raised bed?
So unfortunately, unless you're rotating out the tomatoes, if you're going to be putting tomatoes in those beds again, then you are going to have that disease pressure. So I don't know how feasible it would be to just completely start with new soil, take all the old soil out and start with new. But once again, if you continue to put the same crops in year after year, you will have those issues. So if there's any way for you to rotate tomatoes out at least for 1 year and leave them out of that bed for an entire season and don't come back to the next, that can help. So maybe you think about putting them in containers if you don't have a lot of space. But that's really the only thing I can think of to help that problem. And I don't know if any of the other agents have any thing they would suggest.
That would be my suggestion too, to either leave that spot just kind of idle for this year, or plant something that's in a totally different plant family and do rotation.
You could always solarize. I have solarized raised beds before, but it doesn't always take care of soil funguses because the heat only sterilizes so far down, and that practice is primarily used for killing weed seeds, which aren't a terribly huge problem generally in raised beds. So you can use that to maybe improve some of the other characteristics of the raised bed, but that's the only other thing I've ever tried, and it worked fairly well. I would take a black piece of heavy plastic and leave that on in the spring of the year for several weeks, and it just basically heats up the bed and can kill certain pathogens, but it certainly doesn't kill all of them. As Faye and Jessica both said, there's no way that I know of to completely kill those not in a raised bed, because it's so intensive. And if you raise the same crops, you're just going to basically have some issues eventually.
Exactly. Our disease.
Yeah, I was going to say the only there's no point in trying to eliminate the pathogens in the soil. They mostly overwinter in the soil, but they also blow in from other beds and other places. Anytime you have a heavy storm, it's gonna kind of blow around. So you're never gonna completely eliminate it from the soil. If you don't have the space to rotate it, that would be the best thing. The next best things, if you can't do that, is to make sure that you're doing your mulching and watering properly and fertilizing properly. So don't over fertilize, making sure that you keep a mulch layer to keep the soil from splashing up, including doing drip irrigation, can putting the leaves up as high as about a foot off the ground as they grow up. So you want to kind of sucker up, remove the suckers to the first flower node, and then remove the leaves below that too. That kind of essentially creates a bigger physical barrier between the soil and the leaves. Because with diseases, it's not so much elimination as just trying to push back the disease progression until after most of the harvest is gone.
Great, thank you guys. That is helpful. And someone asked about the registration link for the April, May, June. And so I put that registration link in there, and then also asked for the slides. And then I can email those to you, Jessica, if you want to send them out to everybody, if that would work.
That's fine.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so next question, similar to what Adam was talking about, I think though, my yellow squash in raised beds, they get mildew and have to spray with neem oil. Can I prevent instead of treat?
Adam, do you want to?
The biggest thing there is if you're having mildew problems every year, would be to apply those fungus, either spread them out so that way you're getting better airflow through the plant itself. That's going to help lower the incidence of powdery mildew, or look for mildew resistant varieties. If you can't go after that, then your best bet is to, instead of spraying the neem oil when you see it, is actually start applying it just before you start seeing it. That way you can get ahead of the infections.
Thank you, Adam.
Jinx. Adam's studied disease for all through his entire college and master's degrees. So we usually refer to him, the disease questions to him.
Yeah, he's our plant pathogen guy. Someone asked for the guidebook link. That's the ID 128. I will post that in just one moment. If you weren't on here at the time and can't go back in the chat box. And then let's see. When you talked about bulk soil compost delivery, is the company a local service in Central Kentucky? And is the mix OMRI certified?
Yeah, so you can find, there's a few different resources. So here in Woodford County, we have Winnie the Pooh compost, and some other places you can get at Woodford Feed, you can get bulk compost and topsoil. And then I think at McDougall's they sell, but if you're talking about in the Central Kentucky area, Landscapers Corner actually does sell an OMRI approved product. And so if you're organic, you can get that product there, and it is certified. So OMRI approved at Landscapers Corner. And they get it through Creech, with CREECH, which is where they get it from, but Creech usually just works in very large bulk quantity for, I think, selling to companies like Landscapers Corner, but you may reach out to them and see if you can get it directly from them. I have checked before, and I think the price is similar to what Landscapers Corner sells to, but you have to order more from them. It is a little bit cheaper, but I think you have to order a large amount to get it from them. So.
Okay, thank you, Faye. So let's go in through the chat box still. Faye put in the registration link for our next 3 months of webinars that the 4 of us are putting together. A lot of, I know in Harrison County, it's coming out in my April newsletter, so they've not really seen that yet. But you're welcome to go ahead and register. We've got a handful of people that have. Someone asked where they can find the video of constructing the beds to see the full 8-minute video, and Faye put a link there. I put a link to the ID 128 publication, and I think that is everything. So if there's any other questions, well, we have one more that just came in. Okay. From Ruth, her background, she says, I just put in some sort of raised bed this month. The area is in Franklin County, or on Franklin, I can't talk. The area is on Frankfurt clay soil covered with mulch for the last 2 years, scraped off the mulch, tilled with an electric tiller, added a generous amount of compost, retilled to mix it in. The far bed is currently covered with bird netting and planted with cool season veggies. The near bed is not planted yet, covered to keep the cat out of it though. The edges are old used horse fence posts. Will this sort of setup work well in Kentucky?
I would say yes. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work. It sounds like you've amended the soil by incorporating, tilling. It's good that you took off. I think you said you put a bunch of mulch on there, but you took that off because with mulch, unless it can tie up a lot of nutrients if you incorporate it into the soil. So if you took that off, that's good. And it sounds like you've done a lot to try to fix that clay soil by adding the compost and everything. So yeah, I think there's not an issue with doing that. Sounds like a good system.
I agree. Another question just came in. Is there a good guideline for putting in soaker hose or drip irrigation?
And I did mention, I thought I had, because I had taken pictures just actually yesterday or day before of our drip in our beds, and I completely forgot to put a picture of that in there. I apologize. But we do, I think, have a publication now. Jessica, I recall a publication of drip irrigation on the Small Garden publication, but I'm not sure on that. So if you want to, or anybody else on this call that wants the drip irrigation system that I use, I'd be happy to send you that information along with pictures of what it looks like, how we did it, because it's a pretty good system. And it's not really a soaker hose, it's a drip hose, which I like because it doesn't break down as fast as some of the soaker hoses. So I'd be happy to send you that information, and if I can find that publication, unless Jessica did.
I'm not aware of the publication you're talking about, but I'm doing a search for it right now, not coming up with anything yet. So
That's
Ray and
really
Adam.
good. I think on Penn State, Jessica. I'll look for that one. I was just
Okay.
looking through my files and I can't find that one. I'll try to find it in the next few minutes.
Okay.
I believe it's Penn State that I use. I'll look for that and post that right at the very end, folks.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, soaker hoses do work really well too. If you don't want to really install the full drip, that's what I use as a soaker hose. And I actually don't have raised beds now at the house I'm living in now, and I still use soaker hose just in my garden, but you can move it around where you need it. And it's pretty easy to work with, especially if it's a small, if you've only got 1 or 2 beds, then that can be pretty helpful.
Very good point, Jessica. That's true, because when we've had just ones that we put in, it is a bigger deal to put in some of the drip than it is just to use a simple soaker hose that you hook up and do. So yeah, for sure. I put my email in there in case anybody wants to email about that too, or email me with that to get that information.
Okay. This is good for the group. On your registration link, the space for your name won't accept my name. It says I need a valid email address. So the form is asking for our email address 3 times and won't let us put in our name. So I will look into that. I'm the one that set that up. So I don't know if there's something that I need to, I don't know. I will look at that. So try again in a little, like this afternoon, and we'll hopefully that will be working out. It does ask for your email address a couple of times, so it's just because that's how the system works. But yeah, so Jennifer, I will look into that. We've not gotten any more questions. One thing I want to point out to everyone is this is our last session for March. So the recordings from these will be available soon, within the next week or 2, for the March sessions. And you can find that on any of our 4 horticulture web pages within the extension office. So that's Bourbon County, Harrison County, Woodford, and Franklin County. And we do have our previous classes that we taught starting back in January. The recordings of those are available on our web pages. So you can check those out there. And if you have not signed up for the next quarter of classes for April, May, and June, Faye showed the flyer for that just a moment ago, and I can actually send out a link once I get the Google document fixed, I will be happy to send out a link to everyone that has registered for any of the classes so far, just so you can have that to sign up for the next section as well. And Ray just put a link in the box, in the chat box. He says, here's a good brief extension article on setting up a small home garden irrigation system. So definitely check that out, especially if you have a very large area and you want to do a little bit more extensive irrigation than a soaker hose.
I like that guide, folks. That is the Penn State guide Jessica just mentioned, because it's got pictures of all the individual components. But what you're going to run into in a home garden is that not all order sources cater to home gardeners. In other words, they'll want to sell you 1,000 foot of drip tape or some kind of specialty system that's larger. There are certain suppliers. I don't prefer one over another, and I'm not suggesting one over the other, but there are some that contact your local extension office and we can dig up sources for that do cater to home gardeners. There are some out there that do a better job with home gardeners than others. And I'm even told that some local box stores like Lowe's Lowe's specifically in Fayette County. I was there one day last year and I was impressed by the fact that they carried all of these irrigation supplies in that article. They pretty much carried all of those for home gardeners. So it's becoming more commonplace for home gardeners to irrigate, because there's a lot of money invested in that. So pretty good article, a lot of great pictures. So if you're interested in that, check it out.
One other note, if we don't have any other questions, if you attended this class or any of the other March classes, you will be getting an email from me with a survey in the near future. So be looking for that. Are there any other questions from anyone? Doesn't look like it. So thank you all again for joining us today. Faye, thank you for a great presentation. We have a lot of thank yous in the chat box and telling you good job, and great information and all that stuff. So
Great. Thanks, everyone.